reality shows, don't you?
Some people do anything for clicks.
Even with a truly great story, there's bound to be a few bumps in the road somewhere. Anyways, welcome back, true believers and all you spectacular Spidey fans, to another really interesting Spider-Man PS4 related video. And we are back with another top 5 list relating to the game, where last time we talked about the top 5 best story moments throughout the main narrative of Marvel's Spider-Man, and now we are talking about the top 5 worst story moments throughout the entire game. And just like in the last video, the same rules apply with this list as they did for the previous one. So the two primary factors are that none of the DLC moments will be featured within this list, because that will indeed be saved for another video. And as for the second moment, each character that you will see on this list will only be brought up once. This will allow for a variety of moments to pop up throughout this list instead of focusing on just one character, but rather a multitude of different aspects of the game's story. And just to be clear, I think this is one of the best Spider-Man stories that has ever been created, and I had an absolute blast when playing through the game myself. However, these specific points during the game's story are bits of the narrative that I think Insomniac could have expanded upon a bit more or focus on just a little bit longer. So even though I do like the story overall, I will be pointing out some of its flaws. And without further ado, let's get on with the show. Number 5, some of the fights with the Sinister Six.
Trap failed?
Softened him up. Time for plan B.
Now, don't get me wrong, I fully love Insomniac's version of the Sinister Six, especially the main leader of Dr. Octopus. Seeing the majority of Spidey's rogues gallery team up together on top of the Raft prison was easily a huge highlight of the main game. However, when it came to fighting them individually, or should I say in pairs, that was where the story started to feel a bit rushed. Brian Intar did say during a spoiler cast that they were originally going to have these members be in their own unique boss battles, but they instead decided to combine them as pairs. And the reason why that's the case is because the story was already fully cramped with tons of awesome characters like Miles Morales, Mary Jane, Aunt May, Mr. Negative, Otto Octavius, and lots more. So when Insomniac decided to include the Sinister Six within the game, instead of having them in their own individual boss fights, they decided to make the story a bit more focused by having them team up in pairs. And even though this is a very smart decision on Insomniac's part to keep the characters in the game while still having the story make sense, it did feel a tad rushed after defeating them in their boss fights. And even though I do like the fact that Peter has been experienced as Spidey for 8 years and has gone up against all these foes numerous occasions, when we actually fought them in the game, that was the last we ever saw of them. Meaning that after we defeated Electro, Vulture, Rhino, and Scorpion, that was the very last time we saw them in the entire game. So even though Spidey's classic foes inclusion within the Sinister Six did feel a bit rushed, it isn't that big of a major problem within the main story, which is why it is number 5 on this list.
You know what Octavius will do if he finds out you failed! I failed? Yes, you freak show! A
little forced together time might help you boys learn to play nice.
However, there is one part of the story that changed majorly from what we saw in the previous trailers into the final product of the main game, disappointing me a little bit into how it turned out. And that scene would go to number 4, Mr. Negative's replacement during the mission of Straw Meets Camel, also known as the E3 2017 demo. So as we all know, on the fateful day of June 13th, 2016, that was when Sony fully announced the reveal of Spider-Man PS4 being developed by Insomniac Games and published by Marvel and Sony directly. And for a full year, we basically got no new information relating to the game whatsoever. Sure, we did get a few snippets here and there about the game, showing little bits of new footage of it, but it wasn't a full gameplay demo like what we saw in E3 2017. And during E3 2017, when that demo actually revealed itself, that was truly the first first time we saw actual footage of the game being played out. And one of the biggest highlights of that demo was the reveal of Mr. Negative being one of the main villains of the game. I remember when I first saw this footage thinking that it was going to be so cool chasing after Mr. Negative in this awesome helicopter throughout the streets of New York. Especially during the end of the demo where Mr. Negative got his hands on Spider-Man made me even more excited to where the story could possibly go. However, as we all know, that was simply a ruse from Insomniac in order to showcase a really cool character that was going to be featured in the game just as a demo teaser. And if you don't know what I mean, Insomniac did say during a live stream that it was always originally going to be an inner demon on the helicopter, but instead for the demo they switched it out for Mr. Negative to make it more cinematic. And even though the helicopter chase was pretty much the same thing what we saw in the E3 2017 demo, I still find it a bit disappointing that we chased after a demon instead of Mr. Negative. Even though it was a twist finding out that it was a demon causing all this trouble in the first place instead of Martin Lee himself, I do think it would have been better if it was Martin to have that dynamic between him and Spider-Man.
I'm getting reports of a helicopter with a wrecking ball?
Yeah, things with the demons got complicated. Sit tight, Yuri. I got this. Please, let me have this.
I'm getting reports of a helicopter with a wrecking ball?
It's complicated. Turns out Martin Lee is running the demons.
The guy who runs the homeless shelter?
Like I said, complicated. Sit tight, Yuri. I got this. Please, let me have this.
Which is why that perfectly segues into my next pick for my list is number 3, Spider-Man does not turn negative.
I'll take this. What are you doing to me?
Giving you a new perspective.
So once again, Insomniac already knew what they were going to do with the game's main story, so the biggest red herring throughout the entirety of the game's marketing was that Spidey was going to turn negative from Martin Lee's powers. And if you don't know, from the comics, Spidey at one point did in fact turn negative from Martin Lee's powers, and I was really excited to see that being played out through the game, but that did not happen at all. And even though we did end up getting the negative Spider-Man suit as an alternate costume to wear in the game, and it even has his own Funko Pop, we didn't actually get to see this be played out as a main component of the game's narrative. And yes, even though I do like what Insomniac did with having Spidey go into Martin Lee's inner psyche of the negative realm, I still think that having negative Spider-Man as a main story point would have been amazing. This isn't only just from a visual standpoint, but also from a narrative standpoint to hear Yuri Lowenthal's voice acting as evil Spider-Man / Peter Parker. Plus, if you're also able to see Peter's actions as a negative person affect those close to him, I do think that would have been a really cool dynamic to handle. Although one thing that redeems this part of the story is that we did get a huge tease to Venom being the main antagonist of the sequel to Spider-Man PS4, which hopefully means that we will also get black-suited Spider-Man in this sequel as well. And hopefully from a story standpoint, that is where we'll be able to see Spidey go fully negative and embrace his darker emotions when he does have the black suit on him. Still, not having negative Spider-Man as an actual story point and only just as an alternate suit was a bit of a letdown for me.
Put on the mask. Become one of us.
Thanks, but no thanks!
One way or the other, you will join me.
And as for another letdown of the game is a certain portrayal of a character that was featured only briefly but still had a pretty big role in the game regardless is number 2, Tombstone.
The angry drug lord drank alone. There's a poem in there somewhere.
You know better than me. Never was the literary type.
So in my opinion, Tombstone is one of the most underrated Spider-Man villains out there, and I was really looking forward to see his role in the game given all the teases that we got to him during the game's marketing. And even Brian Intar himself said in a recent interview that he wishes that we were able to spend more time with Tombstone to fully develop his character. And with that, I totally agree with Brian because I do think Tombstone was very underutilized within the game's main story. Insomniac's iteration of Tombstone was a bit different from how he's handled in the comics, and that was one of my biggest problems. While they did keep the mob boss aspect of Tombstone in check, I do wish that they focused on that a bit more instead of simply making him a biker gang leader. And even though I do love the idea that Tombstone is the one that made the giant APC for Martin Lee to use and that totally intertwines all of Spider-Man's villains together, I do wish they expanded on his character a bit more. And to this day, one of my favorite versions of Tombstone is from the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon, and if anything, I wish Insomniac took more inspiration from that version of the character than what they did in the main game. There were a lot more possibilities that Insomniac could have done with Tombstone's character rather than just making him some subpar biker gang leader, but there still is a chance he could appear in the DLC of Turf Wars. And even though Tombstone's character portrayal is simply fine in the main game, I do think that he is one of the most underutilized characters throughout the entirety of Spider-Man PS4. His boss fight was very cool, but I think his story could have been handled a bit better if they did want to expand on his character in the main narrative.
Too much to hope you'll be taking it easier now that you're, mortal?
Not a chance. Threat of death just ups the thrill. Hell of a left hook. Can't wait for the rematch.
I can.
I like you.
And before we get to the number one pick on this list, I do have an honorable or rather dishonorable mention for another character in the game of Screwball. Screwball is a super Z-list villain out of all the other Spider-Man characters out there, and it's clear to see that Insomniac only used her just as a joke in the game. Even though her primary side mission in the main game is entertaining as well as all of her DLC challenges, I don't like that that is one character that Insomniac included in the game in the first place. Throughout the game, we get lots of awesome references to a ton of other Spider-Man villains that could have been the main game, like Lizard, Chameleon, Mysterio, and lots more. So seeing that Insomniac actually added Screwball to simply just add her as a joke for the game's narrative as a little side story is a bit upsetting to see. And seeing that Screwball is basically a modern day parody of what social media is like today, I still think that Insomniac could have added another character that fans would have liked to see more, like Lizard or other characters that I just mentioned. And seeing how we even got more of her in the DLC is just a bit irritating on my part, but hopefully she will not appear in the other DLC packs coming soon.
LOL. What are you going to charge me with? I didn't actually do anything. It was all my fans.
She has a point. Gonna be hard to make anything stick.
For a spider-based hero, I'm really starting to hate the web.
But as for the very worst moment of Spider-Man PS4's story is the ending fate of Silver Sable.
Titiskoya. So-called superhero. You think you save people, but you just make it worse. This is your fault.
My fault? He was under your protection. Do you really need two of those?
Stop! We need to brief Mr. Osborn now. I'll go with her. Thank you. I'll remember this.
Now, in my opinion, Silver Sable was actually one of the most intriguing parts of the game's story, and she was performed wonderfully by Nicole Elise. Her initial reveal in the game was extremely entertaining to see play out, as well as her other encounters that we had with her in the main game were always fun to see. And her entire army of Sable International gave you a real challenge throughout the majority of the game. But after all of her character build-up, you would think that we would get a really interesting conclusion with her by having at least a boss fight or another conversation with her in person. But instead, since Norman Osborn ends up getting kidnapped by Mr. Negative, she decides to help Spider-Man get him back with the flip of a switch. And what I mean by this is throughout the entire game, Silver Sable used her army as a huge militia group to make sure that New York was under complete quarantine. Not only that, but also some of her troops decided to be rogue and capture civilians throughout the city. And after defeating every single Sable base in New York, you would think that there would be a huge payoff of that by actually battling Silver Sable in some way in an awesome boss fight. But after everything that happens, Silver Sable decides to simply go and help Spider-Man save Norman and ends up sending him to the feast shelter to have him get medical assistance. And following that up, even after everything that happened, we get a phone call from her saying that she went back to her home of Symkaria to think about the life choices that she has made. And seeing how we're most likely going to be battling Silver Sable within the third DLC of Silver Lining makes me a bit upset that Insomniac cut her portion of the game in order to just make it DLC. Granted, the story was already getting jam-packed with a lot of different plots in the first place, so it is interesting that they are going to give her her own unique storyline in Silver Lining to expand it a bit more. Although, if the game did not have any DLC whatsoever, and that is just how the storyline ended with Silver Sable, I do think that would have felt a bit unfinished. And even though it's not officially confirmed that she will be appearing in Silver Lining, there's already a lot of teases to her character within the heist, and the title itself is a dead giveaway. So even though I like the majority of her involvement within the story of Spider-Man PS4, I think the ending of her storyline was very unresolved and not concluded in the way I think it should have been. And overall, the final act of Silver Sable is indeed the very worst moment throughout the entirety of Spider-Man PS4's story.
You harass my men, destroy my equipment, and cost my client millions. Give me one good reason I should not kill you right now.
Listen, I don't like you, you don't like me. But Lee has your client inside this building right now, and he's gonna kill him if we don't do something.
We could fight each other, or we could fight Lee, but not both. Does it mean we're good?
You will help me secure Norman. After that, I make no promises.
Works for me.
And with all that said, everyone, that's the video I have for you today, and please let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below. What are your personal top 5 worst moments throughout Spider-Man PS4's story, and what did you think of my list? And like I said earlier, even though I have issues with these certain parts of the story, I still think the overall narrative of the game is absolutely fantastic and one of the best Spider-Man stories ever made. And given all the pros and cons we have received of the game's main story, I can't wait to see what Insomniac is going to do in the future with a potential sequel. But anyways, guys, thank you all so much for watching. Stay spectacular, Spidey fans. Peace out.
You know, applause from you makes me want to shower.
Perhaps. But someone should point out I offered you a handsome salary to do just the sort of thing you did tonight. And instead, you've done the big man's business for free. That, my heroic friend, is what grown-ups call irony.